Imagine waking up in the dead of winter. No heaters, no electricity, not even sealed windows. Just the bitter cold seeping through every crack. But somehow, people survived. Not only did they survive, they devised clever, even ingenious ways to keep warm using only what they had. In today's video, we're stepping back into the Middle Ages to uncover the surprisingly smart cold weather hacks medieval peasants used to make it through the harshest winters. If you're enjoying this, consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps out. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. When we picture the Middle Ages, our minds often drift to towering castles, knights in glinting armor, and bustling market towns. But for the vast majority of people, peasants living in tiny villages, the most pressing concern wasn't war or chivalry. It was surviving the cold. Winter in medieval Europe wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a season of hunger, sickness, and death. There was no central heating, no thermostats to turn up, no radiators humming gently in the background. Homes were simple structures, often built from timber, wattle, and daub, with dirt floors and roofs that leaked. Insulation, as we understand it today, didn't exist. The cold seeped in through every crack, every unsealed window, every ill-fitting door, and once it entered, it stayed. As the days grew shorter and the sun dipped lower in the sky, temperatures plummeted. For the medieval peasant, this wasn't just uncomfortable, it was life-threatening. But let's be clear, the threat wasn't only the cold air itself. Winter was a perfect storm of dangers. Food supplies dwindled, crops were long harvested, and if a family hadn't stored enough grain, salted meat, or preserved vegetables, they'd go hungry. The livestock needed to be kept alive through the bitter months, often inside the same living quarters as the family. Disease spread easily in these cramped, unhygienic conditions, and the numbers tell a grim story. Mortality rates in medieval Europe consistently spiked during the winter months. Young children, the elderly, and the frail often didn't survive the season. The cold, combined with malnutrition and illness, silently claimed lives. A simple cough could become a fatal pneumonia. A minor wound could turn septic. Frostbite could take a limb or a life. For the poor, there was no real safety net. Nobles had their thick stone halls, multiple hearths, and access to resources. Monasteries were warmer, better stocked, and more insulated from nature's fury. But peasants? They had to make do with what they had, and what they had was almost nothing. Yet, here's where the story turns. Despite the bleak conditions, peasants survived. Not always, and not without hardship, but they endured, generation after generation. And they did it through resilience, community, and ingenuity. These weren't primitive people stumbling in the dark. These were humans, just like us, resourceful, observant, and adaptive. They developed clever strategies, passed down through families and villages to fight the cold. Simple, effective techniques born of necessity. These were the original life hacks, centuries before the term even existed. Some of these tricks were about heating, others focused on retaining body warmth, conserving energy, or even manipulating their mindset to better handle long, freezing months. They used what the land offered: wood, wool, stone, straw, and made it work. They observed animals, experimented with architecture, layered their clothing, and slept in ways that maximized warmth. They didn't just survive the cold, they outsmarted it. In this documentary, we're diving into the forgotten knowledge of medieval winter survival. Not the grand tales of kings and queens, but the quiet brilliance of the common people. The peasants, the farmers, the laborers who faced nature's wrath with no luxury to shield them. Their lives were a constant battle against exposure. Yet, Within that struggle lies a story of human persistence, and even brilliance. Think about this. With no formal education, no modern science, and no access to global knowledge, these communities figured out how to stay alive in freezing conditions, using nothing but what was around them. No synthetic fabrics, no electric blankets, just wool, fire, community, and wisdom carved from experience. How did they heat their homes with almost no fuel? What did they wear when the cold pierced through their thin walls? How did they sleep at night without freezing? What did they eat when nothing grew in the fields? Each of these questions unlocks a piece of medieval ingenuity. You may be surprised how many of these methods still work today, because some truths are timeless, and in a world increasingly interested in sustainable living, minimalism, and off-grid survival, these old peasant methods might hold more value than ever. But let's not romanticize it too much. Make no mistake, life in winter for a medieval peasant was brutally hard. They weren't thriving, they were enduring. They lived close to death, and sometimes only a few bad days separated survival from disaster. But within that suffering is a story worth telling. It's easy to look back and think of them as helpless or backward. But if you strip away our modern comforts, how many of us would last a week in their world? Could we start a fire from scratch every morning? Could we keep a family warm in a hut with no insulation? Could we survive a month with only what we preserved the summer before? The truth is, the average medieval peasant knew more about surviving harsh environments than most of us do today. They had to. Knowledge wasn't optional. It was survival. So as we begin this journey into the cold, let's step out of our central heated rooms and try to imagine what it was like to live with your children huddled close, to hear the wind howl through your roof at night, to wake up with frost on your blankets, to ration the last of the bread and wonder if you'll make it to spring. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a story of survival, of human adaptability, of simple wisdom, and maybe, just maybe, we'll come away with more than just curiosity. Maybe we'll see the resilience of our ancestors not as a relic of the past, but as something we still carry in us today. So bundle up, because winter is coming, but this time we're traveling back to the Middle Ages, where staying warm wasn't just comfort, it was life, heating the home, without fireplaces. If you were to step into a medieval peasant's home during the heart of winter, you might expect to be greeted by the comforting crackle of a fireplace, a warm hearth glowing at the center of the room. But that image, it's mostly a myth. In truth, fireplaces as we think of them, stone-built structures with chimneys, grates, and controlled flues, were rare in the peasant world. Those were luxuries reserved for castles, manor houses, and the wealthy elite. So how then did the average peasant heat their home without a fireplace? They used fire, yes, but in a much cruder, more primitive form. Welcome to the world of the central hearth. Picture a simple single-room dwelling, maybe 20 feet across, the walls made from wattle and daub or stacked stone. In the center, a shallow pit of earth or stone lined with ash, the hearth. A basic fire burned here, day and night, the only source of warmth and cooking. There was no chimney to carry the smoke away. Instead, it rose slowly, choking the room in a blue-grey haze before escaping through a small hole in the roof known as a smoke hole. Imagine that for a moment, a room filled with constant smoke, the acrid sting of burning wood hanging in the light air, clinging to everything, your clothes, your blankets, your lungs. The ceilings, often blackened with soot. Children coughing in the corner, eyes watering as you try to cook your meal or warm your hands. It was unpleasant, but it worked. That central hearth did more than just heat the room. It was the beating heart of the home, used for cooking, drying clothes, heating water, and sometimes even drying harvested grain. Peasants learned to live with the smoke because they had no choice. And in a strange way, the smoke helped. It preserved the thatch in the roof by keeping insects away and slowed rot. The hearth never truly went out. Even at night, The embers were carefully banked beneath ash to preserve the heat until morning. Matches hadn't been invented. If the fire died, reigniting it meant striking flint and steel, a frustrating, time-consuming process. So the fire was fed daily, guarded jealously, and passed on like a torch through the generations. But fire alone wasn't enough. Medieval peasants had another trick up their sleeves, something we've rediscovered only recently in modern building science: thermal mass. Peasant homes were often built with thick stone walls. At first glance, it might seem counterintuitive. Stone is cold, right? But here's the genius. Stone stores heat. During the day, even on overcast winter days, the hearth's warmth and the weak sun would slowly warm the walls. And at night, those same walls would release that stored warmth back into the room, helping stabilize temperatures. It wasn't perfect, but it created a buffer, slowing the bone-deep chill that crept in during the long nights. These thick walls became reservoirs of heat, silently working to keep the family alive. And then there's something else. Something you wouldn't find in any building manual, but every peasant understood instinctively. People are radiators. The more bodies in a room, the warmer it becomes. That's not just folklore, that's physics. A single human being emits about 100 watts of heat at rest. Put 5 people in a small room, and you've essentially got a 500-watt heater. So peasants didn't live spread out. They huddled together. Families crammed into single-room huts. Grandparents, parents, children, even newborns, all sleeping, eating, and working in the same small space. Privacy? That was a secondary concern. In the dead of winter, warmth came first. Sometimes they'd even bring in their animals, chickens, goats, even pigs, into the home for the night, not just to protect them from the cold, but to share their body heat. Yes, it smelled. Yes, it was chaotic, but it worked. The ambient warmth from a dozen living creatures could mean the difference between shivering and sleeping. This closeness wasn't always by choice, but it built strong family bonds. Children learned early to be quiet during the night, to share blankets, to sleep curled close to their siblings. The hearth glowed, casting flickering shadows across the walls as generations slept inches from one another. It was cramped, smoky, loud, and just warm enough. And speaking of warmth, another unsung hero of medieval insulation was something so simple, it's almost laughable. Straw. Yes, straw. The dried stems of grain crops, the stuff we might today associate with hay bales and farm decorations. But to the medieval peasant, straw was a life-saving material. They used it everywhere, stuffed into the gaps between wall timbers, layered under roofing thatch, spread across floors to reduce cold and damp. Peasants even piled it between interior and exterior walls when possible, creating a kind of crude double insulation barrier. And in the harshest winters, they hung woven straw mats or animal skins over doorways and windows, not for aesthetics, for survival. These coverings trapped precious heat, blocked wind, and kept the frost at bay. Straw was cheap, abundant, and easy to replace. And while it wasn't fireproof, it could be dangerous near the hearth. It was one of the few tools the poor could rely on to fight the creeping cold. The ingenuity didn't stop there. Peasants would often dig their homes partially into hillsides or into the ground. Earth provided natural insulation, maintaining a more stable interior temperature year-round. It was another way to harness the environment without even understanding the science behind it. And yet, despite all these strategies, the homes were still cold. There was no escaping that. Waking up with frozen toes was normal. Seeing your breath inside the house? Expected. Blankets stiff with frost, just another winter morning. But what makes this remarkable isn't just how they coped. It's that they managed to thrive, raise children, pass down traditions, and build communities under these brutal conditions. The peasant home wasn't comfortable. It was functional. Every stone, every thatch, every pile of straw served a purpose. Every person played a part in maintaining the delicate balance of warmth and survival. In a world without thermostats or heaters, without insulation or weatherproofing, medieval peasants relied on clever design, communal living, and an unrelenting will to survive. They faced the cold head-on, every single day, and they made it work. So the next time you turn up your thermostat or complain about a drafty room, remember the hut with no chimney, the fire pit in the center of the floor, the smoke curling up into a hole in the roof, the family sleeping shoulder to shoulder beneath wool and straw. They didn't just survive the winter, they endured it with fire, stone, straw, and the unbreakable warmth of each other. Clothing layers. Wool was life. Imagine stepping outside on a medieval winter morning. The frost clings to the fields like a sheet of white lace. The air bites at your skin, sharp and dry, as your breath hangs in clouds around your face. There's no jacket to grab, no synthetic gloves to slide on, no waterproof boots by the door, and yet you still have to work. The animals need feeding. Firewood needs chopping. Water needs hauling. There's no choice but to go out and face the cold. So what did you wear? If you were a medieval peasant, the answer was simple: wool. Wool was not just a material, it was a way of life. It was the single most important fabric in the fight against winter's deadly chill. Cloaks, tunics, hose, caps, mittens, even bedding, everything was made from wool. Why? Because wool worked. It was abundant thanks to sheep farming. It was warm even when wet. It was durable. And perhaps most importantly, it could be repaired, reshaped, and repurposed endlessly. Let's start with the basics. A typical peasant might wear a long wool tunic, often made from coarse, undyed wool in shades of grey or brown. Underneath, a linen shift or undershirt, though in winter this layer might be wool as well. Their legs would be covered with woolen hose, fitted and sometimes tied with laces at the thigh or knee. Over it all, a heavy cloak, fastened with a wooden or bone clasp, sometimes hooded to shield from wind. There were no zippers, no buttons. Everything was tied, pinned, or wrapped. But every layer had a purpose, and that brings us to one of the most underrated survival strategies of the medieval world: the onion method. Yes, that's right. Peasants dressed like onions, layer after layer after layer. This wasn't just a fluke of fashion, it was a deliberate survival technique. Multiple layers trapped pockets of warm air close to the skin. The outer layers kept wind and snow at bay, while the inner layers held heat. If one layer got wet or dirty, it could be removed, aired out, and replaced without sacrificing all protection. Clothes were adjusted constantly throughout the day, depending on activity and weather. In that way, medieval peasants practiced dynamic thermal regulations centuries before the term existed. They may not have understood the physics behind it, but they knew it worked. Layering also allowed for customization. A peasant might wear 2 or 3 tunics, each one heavier than the last. Sleeves could be rolled or tied. Extra wraps could be added to the legs or chest. Some even stuffed straw or moss into garments for added warmth. Crude, perhaps, but surprisingly effective. But not all wool was created equal. The most prized type was felted wool, made by compressing and matting wool fibers using moisture and pressure. The result? A denser, more water-resistant fabric perfect for winter wear. Felted wool cloaks could shed light rain and snow, while providing excellent insulation. Think of it like medieval Gore-Tex. Heavy, yes, but reliable. For even greater warmth, peasants turned to sheepskin, wool still attached to leather. These were usually worn by those lucky enough to afford them or those who processed their own hides. Sheepskin mittens, vests, or linings offered near unbeatable heat retention. The wool faced inward, the hide faced out. It wasn't elegant, but it was survival-grade gear. And when garments wore out, and they always did, the scraps didn't go to waste. Every medieval household was a recycling plant. Old tunics became mittens, worn-out cloaks were cut into foot wraps, frayed hose were stitched into caps. Even threadbare rags found new life as padding, bandages, or stuffing for shoes. Peasants knew how to make do because they had no other choice. One of the cleverest inventions was the foot wrap, a square of cloth wrapped tightly around the feet, sometimes layered in pairs, then tucked into simple leather shoes or wooden clogs. These wraps could be replaced daily, dried by the hearth, and reused. They absorbed sweat, reduced friction, and added vital insulation. Primitive socks, but effective. Mittens were similarly homemade. Using scraps of wool, felt, or hide, peasants sewed rough hand coverings, often with just a thumb and one shared finger slot. Dexterity was limited, but when the wind cut through your bones, warmth mattered more than finesse. Some peasants even slept in their day clothes, adding layers at night rather than removing them. Woolen caps were worn to bed, cloaks doubled as blankets. Entire families huddled under shared coverings, using their combined body heat to create a survivable pocket of warmth in otherwise freezing conditions. And then there were the truly desperate measures. In extreme cold, some wrapped their limbs in strips of cloth soaked in animal fat, a makeshift water barrier and windproofing layer. Others lined their shoes with straw or moss for insulation. These weren't ideal solutions, but when survival was on the line, ingenuity triumphed over comfort. But wool wasn't just about function. It was tied deeply to identity and class. The poor wore coarse, undyed wool. The rich, in contrast, flaunted finer, dyed varieties, deep blues, vivid reds, rich greens. The ability to wear coloured wool in winter was not just about fashion. It was a visual display of status. I have enough money not only to stay warm, but to do it in style. Peasants, however, didn't mind. For them, survival came first. Wool was life. It had to be washed carefully, too much agitation, and it would shrink or harden. It had to be stored dry. Mildew could destroy it. It had to be patched and stitched constantly. Sewing circles were as common as firewood piles. Children learned to mend clothes before they learned to write. Every thread of wool told a story. A cloak passed from father to son. A mitten sewn from the remains of a mother's tunic. A foot wrap made from a blanket that once covered a newborn. Nothing was wasted, and perhaps that's the greatest lesson from the peasant wardrobe. Utility, adaptability, and care. Clothing wasn't disposable. It was a relationship, something you nurtured, repaired, respected, because it kept you alive. Today, we throw on a synthetic coat and forget the brutal ingenuity of those who came before us. But when the frost came howling through the village and the fire burned low, it wasn't fashion that saved them. It was wool, layered like armor, felted like steel, reused until nothing was left. A fabric of warmth and survival. Sleeping smart. Bedtime survival tricks. Nightfall in medieval Europe didn't come quietly. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the cold swept in like a silent predator. There was no central heating, no electric blankets, no double-paned windows to shield against the icy wind that crept through cracks and under doors. The hearth fire, dimming now to orange coals, offered only a faint resistance to the bitter dark. But the work was done. The animals fed, the children yawning. And now, despite the cold, despite the discomfort, it was time to sleep. In the medieval world, sleep wasn't about rest. It was about survival. And the peasants knew it. So how did they do it? How did people without down comforters or memory, foam mattresses get through freezing nights without succumbing to frostbite or illness? Let's begin at ground level. Quite literally. Peasant beds weren't what we'd call comfortable. There were no box springs, no mattresses stuffed with feathers. Most common folk slept on simple straw mattresses, large sacks or tickings, stuffed with hay, straw, or dried leaves. These weren't fluffy. They were firm, lumpy, and needed constant fluffing to prevent matting. But they did something vital. They lifted the body off the cold ground. Heat rises, cold sinks. Sleeping directly on an earthen or stone floor would sap warmth from the body within minutes. But that thick layer of straw, it created a barrier, a cushion of air that helped trap body heat and stop the cold from seeping in. Peasants often added layers beneath the mattress, old sacks, wooden planks, or even animal hides. Anything that created space between flesh and frost. On top, they piled woolen blankets, worn cloaks, and in the coldest times, spare clothing or sheepskins. It wasn't luxurious, but it worked. Now picture this, a single-room cottage, a straw mattress in the corner. Not one sleeper, but 3, maybe 5 people, curled together like puppies. Why? Because when it came to staying alive, warmth mattered more than modesty. Peasants shared beds. Husbands, wives, children, sometimes even unrelated villagers or travelling labourers. In some households, the bed was a family hub. The parents in the middle, children tucked to the sides, everyone huddled under a patchwork of blankets. The more bodies in one bed, the more shared body heat, and the better everyone slept. This wasn't just about warmth, it was tradition. In many medieval communities, sleeping in groups was the norm. Infants shared beds with their parents. Grandparents might sleep head to foot with grandchildren. Privacy was a rare luxury, reserved for the wealthiest. For the rest, survival-shaped habits, not decorum. Of course, in the heart of winter, there was no such thing as changing into pajamas. No one stripped down for bed. In fact, they did the opposite. You slept in your clothes. The same woolen. Tunics and hose worn during the day stayed on through the night. Cloaks became blankets. Belts were loosened. Boots sometimes removed, but layers stayed intact. Taking them off was a gamble, especially in homes with no real doors or insulation. One gust of wind could turn a cozy night into a life-threatening freeze, and forget fresh sheets or nightly baths. Bathing in winter was rare and risky. Wet skin meant cold skin, and cold skin meant sickness or worse. Cleanliness was maintained through dry methods, brushing, scraping, or simply toughing it out until spring. Now, let's talk about one of the most ingenious cold weather tricks ever used in the medieval world, the bed curtain. At first glance, it might seem decorative. A curtain drawn around a bed frame, often seen in depictions of wealthier homes or inns. But make no mistake, bed curtains weren't for show. They were science. Drawing thick fabric around a bed created a microclimate, a tiny room within a room. The sleeper's own body heat, trapped within the curtains, could warm the space several degrees warmer than the rest of the freezing room. It was a medieval insulation chamber. Even in peasant homes with no fancy bed frames, people found ways to replicate this. They hung rough cloths from ceiling beams. They strung wool blankets or hides around the straw bed. In some places, canopy-like, sleeping boxes, wooden structures built into the wall provided similar benefits. Close the door or curtain, and you had a warmer, more protected space to sleep. This practice was so effective that bed curtains remained popular for centuries, even into the early modern period, and it's no wonder. In a time when every degree of warmth could mean the difference between waking up or never waking at all, trapping heat was a matter of life or death. But the battle against cold didn't end with bedtime arrangements. Peasants were masters of bedtime rituals designed to preserve heat. They warmed stones by the hearth and wrapped them in cloth to place at the foot of the bed. Primitive hot water bottles. They kept coals in closed pots, known as bed warmers, and ran them beneath blankets before sleeping. These were used carefully. Too hot, and they could cause burns or start fires. But done right, they brought welcome warmth to icy bedding. Sometimes, animals slept indoors, not just in barns, but in the house itself. Chickens might roost in corners. A family dog curled at the foot of the bed. Even small livestock might be housed nearby. Their body heat, their breath, added to the collective warmth of the space. Even the fire was part of the sleep strategy. Though peasants couldn't risk a roaring blaze all night, they were careful to bank the hearth's embers, piling ash over the glowing coals to keep them smouldering until morning. That lingering heat offered just enough ambient warmth to take the edge off the coldest hours. And then there was the psychological battle. Darkness and cold prey on the mind. Sleep came easier when people felt secure, so bedtime stories were told, prayers were whispered, loved ones held each other close. In a harsh and uncertain world, the peasant bed became more than a sleeping place. It became a sanctuary, a stronghold, a space of warmth, closeness, and resilience. So while we might imagine medieval sleep as miserable, it was, within its own context, remarkably strategic. Every straw mattress, every layered cloak, every shared bed and drawn curtain was a response to nature's cruelty. A defense mounted with little more than common sense, resourcefulness, and the burning will to see another morning. They didn't sleep to escape the day. They slept to survive the night. Food as fuel, eating to stay warm. In the frozen grip of a medieval winter, survival wasn't just about shelter or clothing or fire. It was about fuel. Not logs in a hearth, but fuel for the body. Because when the frost set in, the wind howled. Through the fields and the rivers froze over, your greatest weapon against the cold was what you had in your stomach. In a world without central heating, food was heat. And medieval peasants, despite their meager resources, understood this with astonishing clarity. Their winter diet didn't revolve around taste or luxury. It was about calories, endurance, and survival. So, what exactly did they eat? Let's begin with the heart of every winter meal, the stew. A good thick stew was more than just dinner. It was a strategy. Into the cauldron went whatever could be, found, root vegetables, grains, and the occasional scraps of meat. Turnips, onions, leeks, and cabbages, the workhorses of the medieval garden, kept surprisingly well through the cold months. If kept cool and dry, stored in cellars or buried in pits, these hardy vegetables could feed a family deep into winter. Then came the grains, barley, rye, and oats, boiled until thick and hearty. Porridge by morning, stew by night. These grains provided slow-burning energy, filling bellies and stoking internal heat like logs in a fire. Meat, if it appeared at all, was usually in small amounts, bones for broth, maybe a bit of pork or salted beef if the family had slaughtered an animal. In the fall, but even without much meat, the peasants understood how to stretch their ingredients. They added beans and peas, thickened with flour, and flavored with herbs like thyme or marjoram. Each bubbling pot was a caloric powerhouse, dense, hot, and nourishing. And because it could be kept warm at the hearth and eaten across days, nothing was wasted. This wasn't cuisine. It was calculated warmth in a bowl. And when winter cut off fresh food, peasants turned to their preserved stores, the hidden treasures of autumn's labor. Fermentation, salting, drying, and smoking. These were the cold season lifelines. Cabbage became sauerkraut, rich in vitamin C and tangy enough to liven up bland meals. Apples and pears were dried in thin slices and stored in sacks. Beans were strung up and hung from rafters. Meats were salted, packed into barrels, or smoked over fires for days. Grain stores were carefully guarded. So were hard cheeses, aged during warmer months and eaten sparingly through the winter. Butter, if available, was heavily salted and stored in crocks underground. The medieval pantry wasn't just about abundance, it was about preparation. Peasants knew what the cold would demand, and they worked year-round to be ready for it, because hunger didn't just mean discomfort in winter, it meant danger. Starving bodies couldn't stay warm, thin children froze in their sleep. The old and the weak withered by the hearth, too frail to generate their own heat. Food was more than nourishment. It was defense. And they didn't just eat it. They drank it too. A cold belly is a slow-burning one. That's why peasants relied on hot liquids to warm their core. Even if food was scarce, a steaming bowl of gruel, a thin mixture of grain and water, sometimes with herbs or fat, could spark warmth from within. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. Then there was ale, low in alcohol, but high in calories, and always served warm. Water was often unsafe to drink, especially in winter when runoff could taint wells. Ale, brewed weak but in bulk, was a safer, more nourishing option. In the mornings, some peasants drank posset, a warm drink of milk, curdled with ale or vinegar, sometimes sweetened with honey or spiced with nutmeg. A strange mix by today's standards, but in its day, it was a warming remedy for the cold and for illness. The warmth wasn't just in the drink itself, it was in the ritual. Holding a hot cup in your hands, sipping slowly by the fire, sharing it with family. It created a kind of psychological warmth that could carry someone through the darkest months. But perhaps one of the most remarkable ways medieval peasants used food to stay warm was by cooking together. In many villages, particularly in Central and Southern Europe, communal ovens were central features of peasant life. These large stone or clay ovens, often maintained by the village or a lord's manor, were used to bake bread, roast vegetables, and heat stews. Why was this important? Because these ovens gave more than just food, they gave heat. Early in the morning, peasants would bring their dough, prepared the night before, to the oven. As the fire roared to life, neighbours gathered, sharing news and waiting their turn. Children warmed their hands by the flames. Elderly villagers came not just to bake, but to feel the glow, even briefly, against their faces. Once the baking was done, the residual heat from the ovens was used to warm smaller pots, boil water, or dry damp clothes. Some villagers lingered, making the most of the warmth before heading back to cold cottages. Communal baking wasn't just practical, it was deeply communal in spirit. A reminder in the isolating cold of winter that warmth could be found in togetherness. And in the home, the hearth was everything. The pot always simmered. Even if there was little in it, even if it was just water and a handful of oats, it kept the fire going, and by extension, the people too. A hot stew over coals became a centerpiece of survival. Children learned to tend it. Mothers guarded it. Fathers chopped wood or gathered dung for fuel. It was life, and it was fueled by whatever the earth and ingenuity could offer. It's easy now to take our pantries for granted, our microwaves, our insulated kitchens and pre-packaged soups. But for the medieval peasant, every bite in winter was hard-earned. Every warm bowl of porridge, a small victory. Every hot drink, a defiance of the cold. They ate to survive, to move, to keep warm, to work another day. They didn't just feed the body, they fed the fire within. So the next time you wrap your hands around a mug of tea or settle down to a warm meal in a heated home, remember them, those nameless millions who weathered winters with root vegetables, fermented cabbage, and steaming bowls of broth. Because for them, food wasn't just comfort. It was heat. It was life. It was hope in a wooden bowl steaming under the frost. Daily life hacks. Move or freeze. In the medieval world, winter didn't come with a pause button. Snow blanketed the earth. The wind carved its way through bone and timber. But the fields, the hearths, the animals, they all still needed care. And so every day, medieval peasants rose before the sun, faced the cold, and kept moving. Because in winter, motion was more than survival. It was strategy. To stop was to freeze. To sit idle was to risk death. This wasn't some motivational slogan. It was a daily truth in the life of the poor. And over centuries of hardship, peasants learned the subtle, clever tricks that kept them alive, not just during sleep or supper, but in the hours between, when the chill never let up. Let's start with one of the most powerful tools at their disposal: movement. Constant, deliberate movement. From dawn until dusk, medieval peasants rarely stopped. Not just because work had to be done, though that was always true, but because keeping the blood flowing was the only reliable way to stay warm. They chopped wood, hauled water, tended livestock, patched roofs, sorted dried food, shoveled snow, spun wool, fetched feed. Anything that could be done was done, not just out of necessity, but as a way to generate heat. Even indoor tasks were approached physically, churning butter, kneading dough, twisting rope. Full-bodied tasks that engaged the arms, legs, and core. Not out of design, but out of necessity. Stillness was reserved for the sick, the dying, or the truly desperate. And when the cold grew unbearable, you moved faster. It's hard for us now, with our heated floors and electric heaters, to grasp how relentless the cold was inside a medieval peasant home. The fire might glow, yes, but unless you were right beside it, the air could still hang frozen. So you stirred, you stood, you shifted. Because the moment you stopped moving, the cold began to win. But peasants weren't alone in their winter struggle. They shared their spaces with creatures who not only worked the land, but helped heat the home. Yes, we're talking about animals, inside the house. It might sound unsanitary by today's standards, but in the Middle Ages, the boundaries between human and animal spaces were often blurred, especially in winter. In many peasant cottages, animals like goats, chickens, and even pigs were brought indoors during the coldest months, not as pets, but as living heaters. A cow in the corner might mean one less child with frostbitten fingers. A couple of sheep tucked behind a wooden barrier offered body heat that radiated into the room. Warmth that made the difference between unbearable and survivable. This wasn't just luck, it was design. Some homes were constructed with split levels, the animals on the lower, slightly sunken level, and the people above. Heat from the livestock rose upward, naturally warming the floor. It was primitive thermal engineering, and it worked. Even the smell, as strong as it might have been, was tolerated, because in the end, a bit of stink was better than a slow freeze. Peasants also timed their entire day to the ebb and flow of daylight, chasing the sun not for light alone, but for warmth. Chores that required the outdoors, wood chopping, hauling water, tending animals, were done during the sunniest window of the day, even if that was only a few hours. Indoor work was saved for early morning or after dark, and everything was wrapped around the central goal. Avoid the coldest times of day whenever possible. In places with longer winter nights, the medieval 2-sleep cycle was common. Peasants would go to bed early, rise in the middle of the night for a few hours to stoke the fire, eat, or pray, and then go back to sleep until dawn. These odd waking hours were often used productively, especially in the cold, when splitting rest into smaller chunks helped avoid the worst of the nighttime chill. But warmth wasn't just about routines. It was about gear, and the feet, always, the first to feel the cold, received special attention. Medieval peasants weren't wearing fur-lined boots or modern snowshoes, but they had tricks of their own. They layered footwear, often wrapping their feet in cloth or wool rags before slipping them into leather shoes or wooden clogs. Sometimes, dried grass or straw was stuffed inside as insulation. It wasn't glamorous, but it added crucial warmth. For the most brutal days, they turned to heated stones, pulled straight from the hearth, wrapped in cloth or wool, and slipped into shoes or tucked under foot wraps. These hot stones offered radiant heat for several minutes, just long enough to get through the early morning chores before toes started to go numb. It was crude, but it worked, and there was something almost ritualistic about it, heating the stones, wrapping the feet, preparing for the battle against the day's cold, not with comfort, but with resolve. Children learned these methods young. The smallest ones might be carried wrapped in cloaks, close to their mothers' chests. Older kids were expected to contribute, fetching kindling, collecting eggs, helping carry food, always in motion, always learning that stillness was the enemy. Even when indoors, idle sitting was rare. Peasants stood while working, rocked on their heels, padded around the room. They shared seats and beds, not just for space, but for shared heat. And in the most extreme cases, families huddled in the warmest corner of the house, behind hangings, or makeshift curtains, creating a miniature insulated zone where they could do chores, tell stories, or simply sit close and endure. Because the truth was this: the cold never left. It clung to walls, it seeped through cracks, it crept under doors, but so did the people cling to life, through motion, through sweat, through shared breath and clever tricks passed down from mother to daughter, father to son. They learned to move with the day, rise with the sun, to make the most of each warm hour and push through every bitter one. They didn't wait for comfort. They created it, step by step, chore by chore, layer by layer. It wasn't easy, it wasn't clean, but it was life, and it was lived with grit. So when you think of medieval winter, don't imagine peasants huddled passively under furs, waiting for the thaw. Picture them in motion, chopping, carrying, cooking, sewing, tending, always working, always moving, because in that cold, relentless world, they knew one simple truth better than anyone: move or freeze. Community over comfort, strength in numbers. In the Middle Ages, survival was never a solo endeavour. When the frost set in and the winds howled through the village, no single family, no matter how clever or prepared, could endure the cold entirely on their own, because in a time before safety nets, before government aid or relief supplies, the most powerful force standing between a peasant and the grave was their community. In winter, the warmth of others wasn't just emotional, it was physical, tangible, life-saving. And when the temperature dropped to deadly lows, one instinct kicked in stronger than all the rest: stay together. Let's begin with the communal hall, the beating heart of any tight-knit village during the coldest months. These weren't luxurious buildings, no grand fires, no polished floors. But for medieval peasants, they were lifelines. When frostbite nipped at fingers and livestock began to die, entire families would leave their cold, smoky cottages and gather together in a single building, often the local longhouse, church nave, or manor-affiliated hall. There, packed tightly, dozens might sit shoulder to shoulder. Children wrapped in rags, elders huddled under cloaks. The warmth of so many bodies trapped between stone walls and thatched roof was better than anything one family could manage alone. Fires burned hotter in these communal spaces, not because there was more wood, but because it was used more efficiently. Instead of 10 small fires struggling to warm 10 homes, one great hearth blazed at the center of a shared space. Stories were told, bread was baked, stew pots simmered, and for a few precious hours, or nights, the bitter cold outside became bearable. These halls were also places of shared strength. The young helped the old. The healthy looked after the sick. And when the storm passed or the frost let up, everyone went back to their homes a little warmer, a little more alive. But what happened when supplies ran low? When the firewood pile was down to its last log, or the pantry offered little more than dried beans? The answer was barter. Even in a world without modern currency, medieval peasants developed local economies of exchange that became most vital in winter. If one family had an extra sack of dried grain, they might trade it for a bundle of kindling. A man with woodworking skills could fashion a new handle for a broken shovel in exchange for a slab of bacon. A woman with spinning skills might trade wool thread for a few cups of oats or a bowl of stew. Winter sharpened this practice to an art. People remembered who had helped them the year before, who owed a favor, who could be counted on. Reputation mattered, because when the cold came, trust became currency. Even lords and landowners, those who ruled from their manors, knew the value of maintaining these relationships. A peasant population decimated by starvation or cold couldn't work the fields come spring. So, during hard winters, some nobles distributed salted pork or old grain, not from kindness, but from strategy. The survival of the many meant the survival of the land. And so, peasants leaned into the one strength. They could always rely on each other, because while isolation meant exposure, mutual aid meant life. When a neighbour's thatch roof collapsed under snow, others came running, patching holes, replacing beams, and sharing straw. When a family lost a cow, others donated milk or cheese. When a widow struggled to chop firewood, the younger boys of the village split logs in exchange for bread or old clothes. These weren't grand gestures. They were daily acts of quiet solidarity, not driven by heroism, but by the blunt reality that next time it could be your family, in need. And this cooperation extended even further. During the coldest stretches of winter, it wasn't uncommon for families to double up. 2 households might sleep under the same roof, sharing beds, fires, food, and chores. It meant tighter quarters, less privacy, more noise, but it also meant double the body heat, double the labor power, and often double the chances of making it to spring. Children were passed between homes, cared for by aunts and neighbors. Laundry was done together, boiled in shared vats heated by communal fires. Wool was spun while stories were told. Food was rationed carefully, not just by family, but sometimes by entire villages. In the harshest winters, decisions were made collectively. Should they slaughter a pig early to avoid feeding it through February? Should a hunting party be sent to search for deer or rabbit in the forest? Should one family relocate temporarily to another's cottage after theirs burned down or froze through? These choices weren't made lightly, and they weren't made alone, because when death hovered just outside the door, the community became the shield. There's a kind of wisdom in this that modern life has largely forgotten, the raw, unfiltered truth that human beings are not meant to survive in isolation. We can't outlast winter alone, not then, not now. But peasants understood it deeply. Their traditions, routines, and survival hacks weren't just about clever insulation or high-calorie meals. They were about people working as one, sharing their warmth in the most literal of ways. They understood that comfort could be sacrificed, but community could not, and it wasn't just practical. It was deeply emotional. During the long, dark nights, with snow blanketing the ground and wolves howling in the distance, the presence of others brought more than heat. It brought hope. Laugh around the fire, a shared crust of bread, a neighbour offering the last of their kindling because they heard your baby coughing. These small acts, barely noticeable in the sweep of history, became the difference between life and death. So when we look back at medieval winters, we often picture hardship, scarcity, suffering, and yes, those things were real, but so was resilience, rooted not in strength alone, but in togetherness. They gathered, they traded, they helped, they carried each other through, not because they had no choice, but because they understood the truth, written into the very rhythm of winter. Alone, you freeze. Together, you survive. Conclusion: primitive but powerful. In our modern world, survival is often hidden behind walls, electric wires, smart thermostats, central heating systems humming quietly behind the scenes. Comfort has become so constant, so automatic, that it's easy to forget one hard truth. For most of human history, winter wasn't a season. It was a threat. And yet peasants in the Middle Ages survived it, without radiators, without fleece blankets, without supermarkets or synthetic insulation. They endured cold that could kill, in homes that could barely hold back the wind. And they did it with methods so simple, they border on genius. We've walked together through the tricks and tools they used, and now, as we close, let's take a moment to truly grasp the brilliance of it all. Straw mattresses and bed curtains. What seems rustic today was once life-saving design. By layering dry straw beneath them and hanging thick cloth around their beds, peasants created microclimates of warmth. Tiny havens in the middle of freezing rooms. Wool clothing and layering. They didn't have Gore-Tex or thermal wear, but they mastered the onion method of dressing, layering coarse wool, sheepskin, and repurposed cloth in ways that trapped warmth and resisted wind. Felted wool became the miracle material of the era. Breathable, insulating, water-resistant, Communal living. They packed bodies tightly into small spaces, not just out of necessity, but strategy. More people meant more warmth. Less space meant less heat loss. And when it grew too cold to bear, entire families, even neighbors, slept side by side. Hot stones in shoes. It's the kind of detail that would make a survivalist today raise their eyebrows in admiration. Pulling stones from the hearth, wrapping them in cloth and slipping them under cloaks or into boots. This wasn't just practical. It was innovative, born of observation and passed down through generations. Food as fuel. They didn't eat for pleasure in winter. They ate to survive. Hearty stews packed with root vegetables, grain and lard. Fermented foods rich in nutrients. Hot drinks that kept the core warm. Every meal was a calculation. How to make it last, how to make it count. Constant motion. Peasants never stood still. They understood instinctively what modern science confirms. Moving muscles generate heat. So they worked, all day, every day, chopping, walking, hauling, stirring. If they stopped, the cold crept in. And above all, community. Nothing they did, not one single winter survival tactic, happened in a vacuum. People helped each other. They gathered in halls, bartered for firewood, shared food and beds and blankets. Survival was communal, not personal, because they knew the rule. You freeze alone or survive together. Now, looking back from our world of heated floors and programmable thermostats, it's tempting to see these techniques as primitive, crude, obsolete. But that would be a mistake, because what medieval peasants practiced wasn't just survival, it was adaptive intelligence. They looked at what they had, stone, straw, wool, hands, neighbors, and asked, how can we make this work? That's the brilliance, the beauty, the powerful lesson we can still learn today, because comfort, as we know it, is a modern luxury. But resourcefulness is timeless. Imagine this. The power goes out. The temperature drops. The roads are snowed in. Suddenly, everything modern is gone. What then? Would you remember to layer your clothing like an onion, using natural fibers instead of synthetic ones? Would you huddle with family in one small room to conserve body heat? Would you stuff your boots with straw? Warm stones in the fireplace and tuck them under your bedding? Would you cook stews that last for days and trade canned goods with neighbors? In an emergency, these so-called primitive methods might just save you, because they're not outdated. They're human. They speak to our deepest instincts, to build warmth from what we have, to share what we lack, to endure together, and there's something else they offer, something even more rare in today's world. Gratitude. When you light a fire and feel its warmth, knowing the labor it once took to gather wood. When you layer a wool blanket and think of the peasants who sheared, spun, and wove it by hand. When you share a hot meal and remember that once, such meals were rationed with care. You begin to see winter not just as a season, but as a test. One that our ancestors faced with courage, grit, and astonishing creativity. So here's the question we leave you with. If modern heating failed tomorrow, which of these medieval cold hacks would you try first? Would you line your boots with straw, curl up under a woolen cloak, move your mattress closer to the fire, or maybe, just maybe, knock on a neighbor's door and share a bowl of soup in a crowded kitchen? Because that, more than any fire coat or stew, might be the truest survival hack of them all. To endure, we don't need perfection. We need people. And a willingness to learn from the past. So the next time you feel a chill in the air, remember the peasants, standing in the snow, cloaked in wool, fire burning low, holding fast to one simple truth. Primitive doesn't mean powerless. Sometimes it means prepared. DIY insulation, medieval style. In the frozen landscape of the Middle Ages, staying warm wasn't just about building the right kind of house. It was about making sure that the house you had could hold in whatever heat it had. And if that meant using whatever you could find lying around, then so be it. Imagine the wind howling through the cracks in the walls, snow piling up against the door, the fire in the hearth a faint glow, struggling to keep up with the biting chill that seeps into every corner. For medieval peasants, it wasn't a matter of choice. It was survival. And in this chapter, we're going to uncover how medieval families fought back against the cold, not with fancy materials, but with clever DIY insulation techniques that harnessed the raw materials of the earth and the animals they raised. These methods were as ingenious as they were effective, because when you're facing a winter that could kill, you can't afford to be wasteful. You need to make the most of everything you've got. So let's dive into the world of medieval DIY insulation, where fur, straw, dung, and even the very walls of your house became part of the battle against the bitter cold. The first line of defense against the cold in a medieval home was often as simple as a fur. You see, it wasn't just for clothing. Animal skins were invaluable when it came to keeping out drafts and insulating against the cold. Furs from animals like sheep, goats, and deer were tanned and used in a variety of ways. From warm bedding to wall hangings, families would hang these furs on the walls of their homes, covering exposed beams, filling in gaps, or draping them over doorways and windows. Animal furs, with their dense insulating qualities, could block the icy wind that slipped through. Cracks, keeping the warmth of the fire from escaping into the freezing air. The thick fur on the inside of the skins trapped heat, while the tough exterior repelled moisture from the outside. Whether they hung them to cover entire walls or simply draped them over doors, these skins added a layer of warmth and protection. In a way, they turned the home into a kind of fortress, one where the cold had to work much harder to get in, and it wasn't just luxury either. These furs were essential for survival. They were gathered, often from animals raised on the family's land, a resource that would be traded or passed down through generations. In a world where every inch of warmth counted, they were invaluable tools in the fight against winter. But animal furs weren't the only material medieval peasants had at their disposal. Wattle and daub construction was common in many rural homes, a method that involved weaving thin wooden branches, wattle, into a frame, and then filling the gaps with a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung, daub. On its own, wattle and daub walls provided a basic level of insulation. But during winter, these walls weren't just left as they were. Straw and dung were often added as a reinforcement, improving the wall's ability to keep in the heat. Straw is a remarkable material. When it comes to insulation, it traps air between its fine stalks, creating a natural barrier that slows down heat loss. When mixed into the daub mixture, it helped create a thicker, more insulated wall. As for the animal dung, it acted as a binding agent, holding everything together, while also providing a level of moisture resistance, which was vital when battling the damp chill of medieval winters. But the brilliance of wattle and daub was more than just the insulation it provided. The construction method itself allowed for easy repairs. If a wall developed a crack or gap, it could quickly be patched up with fresh daub, keeping the cold from finding its way inside. Peasants didn't just build homes, they adapted them, reinforcing walls with whatever was at hand to make sure that the house remained a barrier against the unforgiving elements. For those lucky enough to have a few extra rugs or tapestries, they were more than just decoration. They were practical, insulating tools. Rugs, often made from wool or sheepskin, were an essential part of life during the medieval winter. They were spread on the floors to keep the cold from seeping up from the earth. But many families also hung them on the walls, especially in homes that weren't built with the best materials. The thick fabric acted as a second barrier between the inside and the outside world. By hanging rugs on the walls or draping them over windows and doors, peasants created layers that trapped heat and reduced the risk of drafts entering the home. Tapestries, often woven with intricate designs, could also serve the same purpose. These beautiful pieces of art were not just decorative, they were heavy, often woven from wool or linen, which helped to insulate the walls of a room, providing extra warmth where it was needed most. In times of severe cold, these materials were, often moved around and adjusted based on where the drafts were the strongest. No part of the home was left unprotected. The sheer versatility of using fabric for insulation is an idea that stood the test of time. And if you look at the homes of today, you might still find decorative quilts and tapestries used in much the same way. Perhaps one of the most innovative and often overlooked methods of insulation was the use of oiled cloth or horn panels in windows. In the Middle Ages, glass windows were a rarity. Most homes had simple openings covered by shutters or cloth. This left homes wide open to drafts, and in the winter, that could be fatal. But peasants found a solution that worked remarkably well: oiled cloth. By soaking linen or hemp cloth in animal fat or oil, families could create a water-resistant barrier that still allowed some light to filter through. This simple yet effective technique helped to seal the gaps around windows, preventing heat from escaping while keeping out the worst of the cold. In some homes, horn panels were also used as a form of window covering. The horns of cattle or sheep would be boiled and flattened to create translucent panels that could be placed into window frames. These natural materials were surprisingly effective, allowing light in while blocking the worst of the chill. These innovations speak to the adaptability of medieval peasants. In a world where resources were scarce and every material had to be put to good use, the solutions they came up with were nothing short of ingenious. Looking back, it's easy to see these methods as rudimentary. After all, today we have double-glazed windows, foam insulation, and central heating. But when you consider the sheer resourcefulness that went into these techniques, using animal skins, natural materials, and simple tools, it's clear that the ingenuity of medieval peasants was anything but primitive. It was powerful, and it worked. These primitive methods kept families alive during winters that would have claimed many modern lives. And if anything, they stand as a testament to human ingenuity in the face of adversity. The next time you bundle up against the cold, think about those medieval peasants who, with nothing more than fur, straw, and ingenuity, managed to survive some of the harshest winters in history. And maybe, just maybe, we'll remember that the best solutions are often the simplest. And that survival, no matter the season, is about making the most of what we have. Fire management, maximizing every ember. In the harsh, unforgiving cold of the Middle Ages, fire wasn't just a luxury, it was a lifeline. The hearth was the heart of the home, offering warmth, light, and a way to cook. But firewood was far from plentiful, and the challenge of keeping a fire burning through the long winter nights demanded resourcefulness and ingenuity. This chapter delves into the medieval methods for managing fire, where every ember mattered, and even the smallest flicker could mean the difference between survival and freezing to death. Imagine it's the dead of winter. The wind howls, snow piles up against the windows, and your only source of heat is the fire crackling in your hearth. But you don't have endless wood, and every log you throw onto the flames is precious. So, how do you stretch those dwindling supplies? Peasants, in the Middle Ages, found clever ways to conserve firewood, making sure nothing went to waste. One of the most effective techniques was burning peat or dried dung, two materials that could be harvested from the land with minimal effort, and that burned longer than ordinary wood. Peat, which forms in wetland areas, was especially valuable. It burns slowly and produces steady heat, making it an ideal alternative to firewood. However, it's not exactly something you can just toss onto the fire like kindling. Peat had to be dried thoroughly before it could be used, and that meant careful storage and management. But once dry, it was a perfect fuel source. Similarly, dried dung from animals like cows, horses, and sheep was often collected and pressed into compact bricks, which could then be burned. Dung burns at a higher temperature than wood, providing more heat for less fuel. In this harsh climate, nothing was too humble to be used as a resource. These fuels weren't just a matter of convenience, they were a necessity. Wood, while important, wasn't always available in the quantities needed to survive an entire winter. Peasants learned to manage the heat they generated by making the most out of every piece of fuel. And this included using natural alternatives that might seem strange to us today. Now, Keeping a fire alive from one day to the next wasn't as easy as just adding more logs when the flames died down. The key to surviving the cold was embankment and ember management. Imagine this. It's the dead of night. The fire has burned down to just a few glowing embers, barely enough to provide warmth. It's too late to gather more wood, and you certainly don't want to waste the energy required to start a new fire in the morning. So, instead, the peasants developed a brilliant strategy. They would use embers to start the next day's fire. Instead of letting the fire die completely, they would bank the embers by covering them with ashes to keep them smouldering through the night. These embers, gently glowing under a layer of ash, would remain alive and ready to be rekindled with just a small amount of kindling in the morning. The next day, all they had to do was stir up the ashes, add a few twigs, and before long, the fire would come roaring back to life. This method was far more efficient than starting from scratch, especially when the cold was so intense. By preserving those few glowing embers, medieval peasants maximized the heat they could generate and saved themselves valuable time and energy. In a world without matches or modern lighters, keeping a fire alive was a skill, and the embers were as precious as gold. The simple act of banking a fire allowed peasants to stretch their fuel and avoid having to collect firewood in the bitter cold of winter mornings. But there's another clever trick that medieval peasants used to make the most of their fire. They would use heated stones. Imagine the scene. You've gathered around the fire to warm yourself, but once you move away, the warmth dissipates quickly. Peasants didn't have modern space heaters, so they found a way to bring the heat with them. Large stones were placed near the hearth and heated by the fire. Once they were good and hot, they were removed carefully and placed either in the beds or underfoot for warmth. Stones retain heat for a long time, so these heated rocks would continue to radiate warmth for hours after being removed from the fire. At night, the stones would be placed in beds, and sleepers could snuggle up next to them, feeling the comforting heat soak into their bones, making the difference between a restless, shivering night and a more tolerable one. When not used. In beds, the stones were also placed underfoot, inside footwear or beneath rugs. These natural heat sources offered a kind of portable warmth, letting peasants move about their homes while staying warm. The use of heated stones was simple, yet incredibly effective. It was an example of how medieval people, living in a world without modern conveniences, found ways to make the most of every resource at their disposal. These stones acted as miniature heaters, a testament to how innovative fire management was a key factor in surviving the harsh winters of the Middle Ages. And finally, let's not forget the importance of fireplace construction itself. While we might think of medieval hearths as simple structures, they were in fact designed with efficiency in mind. The hearths, often located at the center of the home, had a large central pit where the fire could burn safely. Above the pit, a chimney or smoke hole was often used to direct smoke outside, allowing the heat to stay inside where it was needed. These hearths weren't just sources of warmth, they also served as the central point of social life in the medieval home. The fire provided warmth, light, and a place to cook meals, but it also acted as a gathering point, bringing families together during the long, cold evenings. It was around the fire that stories were shared, work was done, and meals were prepared. The fire was life itself, not just in the physical warmth it provided, but in the comfort and connection it helped foster. In the end, fire management in the Middle Ages wasn't about luxury or convenience, it was about sheer survival. Every ember had value, every stone had a purpose. With clever techniques to stretch their fuel, preserve their warmth, and maximize the heat they generated, peasants found a way to live through winters that could have easily claimed their lives. And while we might never have to deal with the challenges they faced, we can still learn a lot from their resourcefulness. Their ability to maximize every ember and adapt to their environment speaks to the heart of human ingenuity, and perhaps gives us a better understanding of how to survive, no matter the odds. Smart shelter. Design built for the cold. As the winds howled through the barren landscapes of the Middle Ages, the home became the ultimate defense against the cold. It wasn't just the materials that kept peasants warm. The design of their homes played a huge role in maximizing comfort and minimizing heat loss. In this chapter, we're going to explore how medieval peasants, with nothing but their wits and the resources available to them, built shelters designed specifically to trap heat and protect them from the elements. The low ceiling is one of the first things you might notice when you enter a medieval cottage. At first glance, it might seem like a quirky architectural feature, but when you understand the harshness of the cold, it makes perfect sense. In the medieval world, heating wasn't as simple as turning on a thermostat. The fire in the hearth was often the only source of warmth in the home, and without the luxury of modern insulation, every bit of heat had to be conserved. Low ceilings, often just a few feet higher than the average person, were a clever design choice. They trapped the warmth in the lower part of the room, where the people spent most of their time. The closer you were to the fire, the better. By keeping the ceiling low, the heat would remain concentrated near the ground, where it was needed most. In contrast, modern homes often have high ceilings, allowing heat to rise and escape quickly. But in the medieval world, low ceilings served a very practical purpose. They kept the heat right where you needed it, with the people. As simple as this design might seem, it was a crucial element of medieval survival, especially in the dead of winter. Next, consider the windows, or more accurately, the lack of them. In a medieval home, windows were small, often just tiny openings in the walls. This wasn't for aesthetic reasons or to create a cozy ambience. It was a matter of practicality. The smaller the window, the less heat could escape. Even today, we know that windows are a major source of heat loss in homes, especially in the winter. So, medieval builders took this into account by designing homes with tiny windows to keep the warmth inside. Instead of glass, they often used materials like oiled cloth, horn panels, or even thin wooden shutters to cover the openings. While these materials didn't let in much light, they did help in keeping out the cold. The small windows helped preserve the warmth generated by the fire. They acted as a barrier against the biting wind outside, creating a much-needed layer of protection from the elements. And even though light levels were low, these homes had a strategic layout that kept them as efficient as possible, making the best use of every inch of available heat. But it wasn't just the windows that mattered in the design. The placement of the entrances was just as crucial. In the Middle Ages, most homes faced south. Why? Because this direction offered the most sunlight exposure, especially in the winter months. A south-facing entrance maximized the amount of sunlight that would enter the home during the shorter days, naturally warming the interior. The sun was one of the few sources of warmth that peasants could rely on, and so they designed their homes with this in mind. By orienting their homes toward the south, they ensured that they could capture the maximum amount of solar heat possible, especially in the colder months when the sun's rays were at their weakest. While they didn't have access to the modern concept of passive solar design, medieval peasants intuitively understood the value of sunlight. By taking advantage of natural sunlight, they could extend the life of their fires and reduce the amount of fuel they needed to burn to stay warm. And then, there's the concept of earth burning, a technique that would be considered ahead of its time. In many rural areas, especially in colder regions, homes were partially built into the earth. This method of construction, known as earth burning or building into the earth, involved digging into the side of a hill or mound and constructing the home within it. The earth itself acted as natural insulation, offering an additional layer of protection against the cold. The thick earth surrounding these homes kept them cool in the summer and warm in the winter. The thermal mass of the earth absorbed the warmth from the sun during the day and slowly released it at night, keeping the interior of the house more stable temperature-wise. Homes built in this way were more efficient at retaining heat, and they didn't require as much firewood to maintain warmth. The earth also helped shield the house from the brutal wind that could otherwise seep through the walls and under the roof. These earth-bermed homes were often dug into the hillside, with the roof or part of the structure extending above the ground. The entrance would typically be at the higher end of the structure, where it could receive more sunlight. The walls of the house were made from stone, wood, or wattle and daub, further enhancing the home's ability to hold heat. The practice of earthbombing wasn't just about comfort, it was a matter of survival. In regions where winter temperatures could dip far below freezing, having an earth-sheltered home meant you could survive the coldest months without constant fire stoking. In fact, many medieval peasants took advantage of this natural insulation technique long before modern earth-sheltered homes became a concept in contemporary building practices. When we look at medieval homes today, it's easy to see them as basic and primitive. The walls were often made of stone or timber, the roofs thatched with straw or reeds. But the more we dig into the designs of these homes, the more we realize that they were crafted with a deep understanding of the environment. Medieval builders were keenly aware of how the seasons affected their homes, and they used every trick in the book to maximize warmth and minimize heat loss. The design of these shelters shows a level of ingenuity that would be the envy of modern-day architects, trying to create eco-friendly, energy-efficient homes. The use of low ceilings, small windows, south-facing entrances, and earth-bermed structures was all about making the best of what the land could offer. In today's world, we often take for granted the luxury of central heating and double-glazed windows. But the medieval peasants had to be clever in ways that we can only begin to imagine. The shelters they designed were not just homes. They were sophisticated survival tools. Every design element had a purpose, and each was aimed at preserving warmth and minimizing energy waste. Looking back, we can see how the resourcefulness of medieval peasants can inspire modern solutions. After all, who wouldn't want to live in a home designed to make the most of nature's warmth and protect against the cold, using just the materials and knowledge available? The next time you feel the warmth of a home on a cold winter's day, think of those early builders and their practical, ingenious shelter designs. They were truly ahead of their time. Psychological tactics. Beating the cold mindset. Surviving the bitter cold of the medieval winter wasn't just about physical resources, tools, or shelter. It was equally about mental resilience. When your world is surrounded by ice, snow, and endless nights, the toll on the mind can be just as crushing as the cold itself. This chapter explores the psychological tactics medieval peasants used to beat the cold mindset and maintain their spirits through the darkest, longest days of winter. The first strategy was to accept the cold as normal. In modern times, we might look at a cold snap and complain about the discomfort. But for medieval peasants, the cold was an ever-present companion, and part of survival was adapting mentally to it. For them, it wasn't a question of whether winter would be hard. It was simply a matter of enduring it, because that's what life demanded. Peasants grew up in environments where cold wasn't just an occasional inconvenience. It was a permanent fixture of the seasons. To survive, they needed to learn how to embrace this reality, rather than fight against it. If you could mentally prepare yourself for the frigid temperatures, the long nights, and the scarcity of food, you stood a better chance of surviving. Cold wasn't something to fear. It was just a part of life. This mindset didn't just make survival more bearable, it actively boosted resilience. Instead of seeing cold as an external enemy, peasants internalized it. It was a known threat, something they were prepared for from childhood. In this way, they developed a mental toughness that allowed them to endure hardships that would break the spirit of many today. But acceptance wasn't the only psychological tool at their disposal. Superstitions and rituals played a huge role in medieval life, especially when it came to warding off the cold. Superstitions offered a sense of control in an otherwise uncontrollable environment. The medieval world was full of magic and mystery, and for peasants, rituals could provide a psychological shield against the unknown forces of nature. Many believed that winter's chill wasn't just an environmental condition, but the work of evil spirits or other supernatural forces. Cold spells were often seen as the result of malevolent actions, like witches casting curses or malicious entities sending frost to kill crops. To combat these forces, peasants would turn to rituals and charms. One common practice was the burning of herbs or incense in the hearth to purify the air and protect the home from the bite of winter. They also placed protective amulets above their doors or windows, often in the form of religious symbols or personal talismans, believing that these items would ward off the cold. Some would even sprinkle salt or burn a mix of incense to trap the cold outside the house, reinforcing the idea that through rituals they could outwit the elements. These actions, while clearly symbolic, helped to reduce anxiety. By performing rituals, peasants believed they could influence the environment around them, even if it was just through the comfort of a predictable routine. During the long, cold nights, distraction became a key psychological tactic for survival. As the fires dimmed and the wind howled, the cold wasn't just a physical presence, it was an overwhelming mental burden. To pass the time and keep the cold at bay, peasants turned to singing and storytelling. Sitting around the hearth, families would gather to share stories of their ancestors, tales of saints, or even legends of creatures that roamed the wilds. The stories were a way to distract the mind, to take it off the cold and immerse it in the warmth of tradition, community, and imagination. There was a psychological power in these narratives, as they transported the listener into a different world, a world far away from the harshness of winter. Singing was just as vital. The act of creating sound and rhythm brought a sense of unity, of collective warmth that transcended the individual. Songs were often invocations of warmth, with lyrics that described the warmth of the hearth, the hope of better days ahead, or the solidarity of community. When the temperature outside was below freezing, singing provided a mental shield against despair, allowing peasants to find joy in the simplest of things. Storytelling and song became the thread that held the long, cold nights together. By focusing on something other than the biting chill, the people were able to keep their spirits high and their minds engaged, turning winter's oppressive darkness into something more manageable. Finally, medieval peasants had another powerful, psychological tactic in their arsenal: religious fasting and feasting. Winter was often a time of scarcity, and food stores could dwindle to dangerous levels as the months passed. This made meals far more than just a way to fuel the body. They were a spiritual and psychological experience. Feast days, religious holidays, and fasting periods marked the passage of time and helped to psychologically break up the monotony of winter. Feasting, especially on special holidays like Christmas or Easter, was an opportunity to celebrate survival and provide a brief respite from the struggle of winter. It gave peasants something to look forward to, an event where they could come together, celebrate the return of warmth, and share what little food they had. These moments of celebration were vital for maintaining morale. On the other side of the spectrum, religious fasting during the Lenten period, or other times of spiritual observance, was a psychological coping mechanism. Although fasting meant going without food for a time, it also meant a renewed sense of purpose. It was a way to focus the mind on higher spiritual goals rather than the physical discomforts of the world. The ritualistic nature of fasting gave peasants a way to feel in control of something, even when their physical environment was beyond their control. When winter turned the world outside into a frozen wasteland, the mind became just as important as the body in ensuring survival. Medieval peasants understood this implicitly. By building mental resilience, relying on rituals to ward off fear, using storytelling and song as distractions, and turning to religious practices for both comfort and structure, they were able to combat the psychological strain of the season. Today, we have the luxury of central heating, warm clothing, and luxuries that keep us from facing the same trials. But the resilience that medieval peasants developed is something we can learn from, particularly in how to adapt to difficult conditions and find strength in the midst of adversity. In the face of bitter cold, it wasn't just about surviving physically. It was about surviving mentally, and the psychological tactics they used to beat the cold mindset played an essential role in their endurance. Perhaps, in our own struggles, we can take a lesson from their ability to find light, warmth, and community even when everything around them seemed to freeze. Animal assistance. Furry survival allies. When you think of medieval survival, It's easy to imagine peasants battling against the elements alone, huddled by their hearths. But in truth, the key to surviving the brutal winter months was often a partnership with the animals that lived alongside them. Animals weren't just companions or sources of food. They were vital survival allies. In this chapter, we'll explore how animals, from livestock to household pets, played an essential role in helping medieval peasants survive the coldest months. Let's start with the most obvious but often overlooked survival ally: livestock. In the medieval world, it wasn't uncommon for cows, goats, and chickens to live inside the peasant's home. This might sound strange to modern sensibilities, but it was a clever way to maximize heat production. Livestock are warm-blooded creatures, and their body heat was incredibly valuable during the long, cold winters. Peasants kept their cows and goats inside the home or barn, sometimes even sleeping alongside them. This was a symbiotic arrangement. The animals provided warmth, and the peasants kept them safe from the freezing temperatures outside. The stables and homes were often small, rustic structures, and the presence of animals meant that extra body heat was being radiated into the living space. This, combined with the fire in the hearth, made a significant difference. And it wasn't just the large animals. Chickens, for example, were often housed in small pens inside the house. Not only did the chickens provide eggs and meat, but their constant activity helped to generate warmth. Even a small flock of chickens could make a noticeable difference in keeping the interior of a house a little warmer. Animals, in essence, acted as a living furnace, offering a source of heat while also being a steady provider of food, milk, and eggs. Moving from livestock to the more familiar companions, we now look at dogs and cats. These animals weren't just there for companionship. In the harsh, cold winters, they were crucial to the peasants' survival. Dogs, in particular, were vital for warmth. Their fur acted as an insulating barrier, and their body heat was highly prized in the long, cold nights. While a dog might have been expected to guard the home or help with hunting, they were also likely to curl up next to their owners at night, offering some relief from the cold. Cats, while smaller, also played an important role in keeping homes warm. It's often said that cats are self-sufficient when it comes to warmth, seeking out the coziest corners of a room. But they didn't just warm the bedclothes or hearthstones. Cats also played a crucial role in controlling pests, keeping the rodent population in check, and ensuring that food stores didn't get contaminated by rats or mice. This, in turn, helped maintain a cleaner and healthier living space for the peasants, which was a crucial factor in survival. Both dogs and cats, in their own way, acted as psychological comfort as much as they did physical warmth providers. Their presence offered the reassurance of loyalty and familiarity in an otherwise harsh and unyielding world. And, during long winter nights, this emotional warmth was as important as the physical warmth they provided. Moving beyond companions and livestock, there was a wealth of material from animals that helped to insulate and protect peasants from the winter cold. The key players here were sheep and geese. In a time before synthetic fabrics, wool and down feathers were some of the best materials for insulation, and they were provided by the very animals peasants raised. Wool from sheep was an incredibly versatile material. Sheep were sheared in the spring, but their wool was used for clothing, blankets, coats, and tents. Wool is naturally thermoregulatory, meaning it keeps you warm in the cold and cool in the heat. It's also an amazing insulator that traps air within its fibers, which prevents heat from escaping. Peasants wore woolen cloaks, tunics, and undergarments, layering them for maximum warmth. Woolen socks and gloves were common, and felted wool was used for additional waterproofing and insulation. Goats, too, provided mohair, another type of wool that was used to make more durable clothing. Goat fur was often used for blankets, as well as hats and mittens, helping to keep peasants warm in their everyday life. These fibers were often woven into thick, insulating fabric, giving peasants a substantial defense against the cold. But it wasn't just wool that helped combat the chill. Down feathers from geese were highly prized for their insulating qualities. The soft feathers from under the bird's tougher outer layer could be used to make comforters, pillows, and even warm clothing, like jackets or blankets. Down was lightweight, but incredibly efficient at trapping heat, making it one of the best natural materials for staying warm in the extreme cold. When it came to survival, medieval peasants weren't interested in wasting any part of an animal. Every scrap had a purpose, and they knew how to use every single part of the animal they raised. Bones were often carved into tools like needles, combs, and buttons. Hides were turned into leather for clothing and footwear. Hooves were used to make glue, and fat was rendered down for cooking, lamp oil, and even medicine. Peasants also made use of animal droppings such as manure to fertilize crops in the spring. These waste products were anything but wasteful. They were key resources in a self-sustaining system where nothing went unused. Even teeth and claws had their uses. These could be made into tools, jewelry, and even weapons in a pinch. When you lived in a time of scarcity, making use of every part of the animals you raised was not only practical, it was a matter of survival. In the end, animals weren't just part of the medieval peasant's life for companionship or food. They were essential to surviving winter. Whether it was the heat from a sleeping cow or goat, the warmth provided by a dog curled at your feet, or the luxury of woolen clothing and down-filled bedding, animals were an invaluable resource. They didn't just help keep people physically warm. They were woven into the very fabric of medieval survival. Livestock, pets, and wildlife helped in ways that modern conveniences often overlook. When the world outside was frozen and inhospitable, it was the animals that helped make life bearable and ultimately possible. By living alongside animals, the peasants created a system that was as much about mutual cooperation as it was about survival. It was a partnership, one that provided warmth, sustenance, and a sense of companionship in a time of isolation and cold. Water, ice, and survival focused on how medieval peasants managed one of their most vital needs during the harsh winter: water. When winter tightened its icy grip on the medieval countryside, it wasn't just warmth and food that became scarce. One of the most basic necessities, clean water, turned into a daily struggle. Frozen rivers, locked wells, and snow-covered terrain created a daunting challenge. How to access and store water in a world with no plumbing, no faucets, and no defrosters. And yet, medieval peasants found ways, clever, practical, and sometimes ingenious ways, to survive. In this chapter, we dive into how water was managed, how ice was sometimes used as a tool rather than an obstacle, and how snow became an unlikely ally. During the coldest months of the medieval year, rivers and streams, often the primary sources of water, would freeze solid. Wells might freeze over at the surface, and yet water was needed daily, for cooking, for drinking, for animals, and for washing what little could be washed. So, what happened when the usual sources froze shut? Melting snow became a lifeline. At first glance, snow might seem like an obvious source of water. But the process wasn't as simple as scooping it up and drinking it. Snow had to be collected and carefully melted, often over a low-burning fire or hot stones. Drinking unmelted snow could lower the body's core temperature, a dangerous risk when warmth was already so difficult to maintain. Instead, snow was gathered in clay pots or iron kettles and slowly heated, usually during cooking hours to conserve fuel. The result was often lukewarm, mineral-rich water, not particularly tasty, but essential for survival. In some cases, snow was even filtered through coarse cloth to remove dirt, soot, or debris. It took time, effort, and precious firewood, but melting snow was often the only option when all else failed. Beyond just water acquisition, medieval peasants also understood something surprisingly advanced for their time: the preservation power of cold itself. When food was scarce, what little was available needed to be stored, and winter offered an unexpected advantage. Enter the ice pit. These were underground storage areas, often dug into hillsides or beneath homes. At their most advanced, they acted as primitive freezers, where perishable food could be kept from spoiling. Ice was gathered from frozen ponds or rivers during the coldest weeks of the year and packed tightly into pits lined with straw, animal hides, or sawdust for insulation. Layered this way, blocks of ice could last for months. This practice allowed medieval communities to preserve meat, dairy, and root vegetables, sometimes even into spring. While noble households might have had full-blown ice houses, peasants often made do with smaller cellars or dugouts, where the earth's natural insulation kept temperatures low. This clever use of ice wasn't just about keeping things cold. It was about stretching survival. A salted ham, tucked away in straw-packed cold storage, could mean the difference between hunger and nourishment in the dead of winter. But snow and ice weren't always allies. In fact, they often posed a lethal threat to a village's most basic water infrastructure. If the local well froze, the entire community could lose access to liquid water. To prevent this, peasants took preventative measures. One common trick involved covering wells with thick wooden lids, packed with hay, straw, or animal skins to insulate the opening and block the wind. Some even lit small fires nearby, carefully managed, to keep the wellhead just warm enough to prevent full freezing. Springs, natural groundwater flows, were also guarded fiercely. In some cases, stone shelters or rudimentary huts were built around these springs, forming what we might now call a well house. These small structures, combined with the Earth's own insulating properties, could keep a water source flowing even in the depths of winter. A spring that stayed open was treated like a village treasure, and everyone knew not to waste or pollute it. Another lesser-known method involved partially submerging heated stones in frozen troughs or small water basins to break up ice crusts. Peasants might also use tools like wooden mallets or iron picks to smash through morning ice, especially to allow animals to drink. These weren't high-tech solutions, but they were resourceful, consistent, and critical to daily survival. And perhaps most unexpectedly of all, snow itself, the very symbol of winter's cruelty, was sometimes used as a tool for warmth and protection. It sounds counterintuitive, but snow insulates surprisingly well when packed correctly. Peasants understood this, not through science, but through generations of lived experience. Roofs of cottages and barns were often left snow-covered, intentionally. While modern homeowners might dread a heavy snow load, medieval peasants knew that a thick layer of snow actually helped trap warmth inside. The snow worked like a blanket, preventing heat from escaping through the thatched or wooden roof. Some even used snowbanks or snow walls to their advantage. By piling snow against the outer walls of a home or storage barn, peasants created a barrier that blocked cold winds and added an extra insulating layer. These crude snow berms reduced drafts and made the inside of a poorly built structure feel slightly less unbearable. In times of desperation, snow caves or dugouts were even used for temporary shelter. With the right structure, snow caves could maintain interior temperatures well above freezing, a life-saving fact for shepherds or hunters caught in sudden storms. Snow wasn't just a nuisance. To the informed peasant, it was a neutral material, sometimes dangerous, sometimes essential, but always manageable. When we imagine medieval winters, we often picture endless suffering, endless cold, and endless scarcity. And to be sure, they were hard, bitterly hard. But in the hands of resourceful peasants, even water, frozen, elusive, or buried under snow, became something they learned to master. Through melting snow, managing ice pits, protecting water sources, and even using snow as insulation, they demonstrated a powerful truth. Survival didn't require luxury, it required knowledge. It was this knowledge, passed down through generations, rooted in experience and necessity, that kept villages alive when the landscape turned to ice. So next time you sip hot tea from a modern kettle or run a warm bath with the twist of a tap, remember that not so long ago, water itself was a daily struggle, and ice was both the enemy and the ally. The medieval peasant didn't just endure the cold, they outsmarted it. Medieval cold myths. What they didn't do. a rich and immersive script designed to debunk common misconceptions and give viewers a deeper appreciation for the reality of winter survival in the Middle Ages. When we think of winter in the Middle Ages, the mind conjures up a familiar and often inaccurate image. Peasants huddled in front of grand fireplaces, wrapped in fur-lined robes, sipping hot mead as snow gently falls outside a castle window. It's a romantic fantasy, part fairy tale, part historical fiction, but the truth was far colder and far more impressive. In this chapter, we strip away the myths and uncover what medieval people didn't do, the comforts they didn't have, the luxuries they never saw, and why, despite it all, they still survived. Let's start with one of the biggest misconceptions of all, the fireplace. The idea that every medieval home had a roaring fire in a stone hearth, complete with chimney and mantelpiece, is rooted more in modern imagination than historical reality. In truth, central fireplaces were a luxury, one largely reserved for the nobility and those living in well-built manorial halls. For the average peasant, the hearth was little more than a central fire pit, dug into the floor of a single-room cottage, often without any chimney at all. Smoke rose up and out through a crude hole in the roof. If it escaped at all, many homes were perpetually smoky, their walls blackened with soot. Eyes stung, throats burned. But the smoke also played a secondary role. It helped preserve wooden beams, and it even kept pests at bay. A fireplace with a flue, proper draft control, and even stone surround. That was the stuff of castles and abbeys. For everyone else, it was embers in a pit, covered at night with ash to bank the fire until morning. Efficient? Barely. But it worked well enough to keep a cottage habitable, if not exactly cozy. Next, let's talk about clothing. Specifically, the belief that medieval people, even peasants, wore fur-lined everything in winter. It's a seductive image. Peasants bundled in thick cloaks trimmed with fox or rabbit, their homes adorned with luxurious pelts. But in reality, fur was rare and precious, often reserved for trade or reserved by sumptuary laws for those of higher social rank. Instead, the fabric of life, quite literally, was wool, coarse, scratchy, hard-wearing wool. It was everywhere, in tunics, cloaks, leggings, hoods, mittens, and even bedding. It came in layers, sometimes felted for extra insulation, sometimes greased with lanolin to resist moisture. Peasants might have a sheepskin or a bit of rabbit fur here or there, often reused and patched endlessly. But the idea that their wardrobes were lined in fur from collar to cuff, that's myth, not history. And speaking of myths, here's another one that's both persistent and misunderstood: the medieval attitude toward bathing, especially in winter. Yes, it's true that people in the Middle Ages bathed far less often than we do today. But this wasn't due to ignorance or laziness. In winter, the act of bathing was genuinely dangerous. Without heated water on demand or warm indoor spaces to dry off safely, getting wet could lead to hypothermia, illness, or even death. Add to that the sheer difficulty of procuring and heating enough water, and bathing became something you did, sparingly, if at all. Quick washes were more common, wiping face and hands with damp cloths, rinsing feet, or using herbal rinses when possible. Full immersion, rare, and in the depths of winter, practically unheard of among the poor. But here's the irony: cleanliness wasn't ignored, it was simply redefined by necessity. People changed their undergarments more often than outer layers. They kept lice combs and flea repellents nearby, and they relied heavily on smoke, herbs, and ash soaps to manage hygiene. They didn't smell great by modern standards, but they didn't all walk around caked in filth either. Now let's address one last myth, a bleak and pervasive one, that medieval people simply froze to death every winter, helpless against the cold. This is perhaps the greatest insult to their ingenuity. Yes, winters were deadly. Yes, many did die, especially the elderly, the sick, or those with poor harvests. But to say that medieval peasants were passive victims, of the cold is to ignore the wealth of knowledge and resilience they developed. They insulated their homes with straw and dung. They layered wool with a precision born of survival. They banked fires, slept in shared beds, kept animals inside, and planned their lives around the rhythms of warmth and light. They made use of heated stones, sun-facing doors, earth berms, and thatch roofs buried in snow. They worked together, huddled together, and passed down centuries of hard-earned wisdom about how to endure, and even thrive, through the longest nights. Far from hapless or primitive, these communities were adaptive, observant, and deeply attuned to the world around them. They lacked central heating, sure, but they possessed something just as powerful, a culture of survival. So when we imagine a medieval winter, let's leave behind the myths. No, most homes didn't have grand fireplaces. No, fur-lined coats weren't standard issue. No, winter baths weren't the norm. And for good reason. And no, they didn't all freeze to death. Instead, they endured. With grit, with strategy, with community. Because winter, for them, wasn't just a season. It was a test of everything they knew. About their land, their materials, their animals, their families, and themselves. And every time spring returned, it meant they had passed that test once again. Tools of survival, everyday objects with hidden warmth. In the harsh winters of medieval Europe, survival wasn't always about what people had. It was about how they used it. Most peasants couldn't afford to create new tools just for warmth. There were no commercial heating systems, no thermostats, no insulated boots ordered from a catalogue. Instead, their best weapons against the cold were often the most humble, overlooked items in their homes. Objects not designed for warmth, but cleverly adapted to provide it. In this chapter, we explore how ordinary, everyday things, stones, wood, scraps of cloth, even spoons, were transformed into hidden lifelines. These were the tools of survival. Quiet, practical, ingenious. First, let's talk about heat on demand, the kind you could carry to bed. In a world without electric blankets or hot water bottles, medieval peasants turned to something much simpler: stones and bricks. During the day, flat stones or dense bricks were placed near the central hearth, the warmest place in the home. By nightfall, they radiated heat, storing the sunless warmth of the fire within them like silent embers. Before bed, these stones were wrapped in cloth or tucked between straw-stuffed bedding. Children curled their toes around them. Adults pressed them to their stomachs or tucked them near their backs. Even in shoes, heated stones had their place. Before heading out into frozen fields or snow-covered villages, some peasants would place warm stones into their footwear, letting the heat soak into the soles. It didn't last long, but it made those first cold steps just a little more bearable. When warmth was scarce, every ember mattered. Now, shift your eyes from the floor to the furniture. The medieval home wasn't exactly spacious, but the way furniture was arranged could mean the difference between a tolerable night and a bitter one. Large wooden chests, tables, and even benches were strategically positioned to do more than just store tools or hold meals. They became draft blockers. Heavy furniture was placed along exterior walls to insulate from the wind. Benches were pressed against doorways. A chest at the foot of a bed wasn't just for linens, it helped block the chill that crept up from the floor. And tall cupboards helped trap heat in smaller living areas by reducing the circulation of cold air. It's subtle, almost invisible, but this was medieval insulation, built not with money, but with thought. Next, consider something even more ordinary: a wooden spoon. Imagine it's the dead of winter. Your fingers are stiff, almost numb. You've got a bowl of hot pottage in your hands, but your wooden spoon isn't just for eating, it's also warming your grip. Peasants would hold spoons close to the fire before meals, using them like miniature hand warmers. In fact, any small wooden tool, spoons, ladles, even knitting needles, could serve a dual purpose. Warmed over the hearth, they eased frozen, joints, soothed aches, and offered moments of tactile comfort. These tools were hand-carved, passed down through generations, worn smooth by calloused hands. They weren't just utensils, they were companions through endless winters, often more reliable than the sun. And then there were the blankets. Not thick, mass-produced comforters, but hand-stitched, patched-together scrap quilts, true works of necessity. When new cloth was too expensive to buy, peasants repurposed old garments. Worn tunics, fraying cloaks, threadbare shifts, they were all salvaged, cut into squares or strips, and sewn together with thick thread to make blankets. These weren't decorative, they were patchwork armor, each piece holding a story. A piece from a child's first cloak, a patch from a mother's apron, a swatch from a father's winter hose. The result was warmth born from memory, layers of fabric layered with love. Even the act of making these blankets served a purpose. On dark, winter nights, when fingers could barely move and the air crackled with frost, sewing was an act of resistance, a declaration that they would make it through another winter, one stitch at a time. The truth is, medieval peasants didn't just survive winter by brute endurance. They survived it by reimagining the things around them. A heated stone became a portable hearth. A chest became a wall. A spoon became a shield against numbness. A rag became a lifeline. This wasn't luxury. It wasn't convenience. It was practical magic, woven into the fabric of their daily lives. Even children played a role. They learned early how to spot cold spots in the cottage, where to place stones, which blankets had the least holes. It was a kind of family choreography. Everyone had a role in fighting the cold, and everything, no matter how small, was a tool in the battle. It's easy to think of medieval life as primitive, but look again. These people didn't have waste. They didn't have central heating. They had resourcefulness. They had reverence for the objects that made winter survivable. They didn't see a chair as just a seat, or a blanket as just fabric. They saw possibility, hiding in plain sight. There's a lesson in that for us. In a world where so much is disposable, where we rely on devices and systems to keep us warm without thinking twice, perhaps we've forgotten how powerful a well-placed stone or a lovingly repaired quilt can be. The tools of survival aren't always flashy. Sometimes they're just quietly brilliant. And so, as the medieval wind howled through the thatch and the fire crackled low, families gathered in the flickering dark. They wrapped themselves in scraps. They held warm spoons. They leaned against thick furniture. And they thanked the tools that stood between them and the freeze. Not fancy, not new, but deeply, ingeniously human. Winter chores. Staying useful to stay warm. In a medieval winter, stillness was the enemy. When the temperature dropped and the wind slipped through the cracks in a cottage wall, the worst thing you could do was nothing. Inactivity led to cold, limbs, chattering teeth, and worse. The body, when left motionless, surrendered to the chill. And so, for medieval peasants, there was a rule as unspoken as it was vital: keep moving or freeze. Winter chores weren't just about survival in terms of food or fire. They were about maintaining body heat, keeping blood flowing, and finding purpose in a season that threatened to slow everything down to a deadly stop. Whether indoors by the faint glow of a dying fire, or outside in the brittle dawn frost, every action counted. Every task was a tiny rebellion against the cold. Inside the peasant home, activity was constant. Even in the smallest one-room cottages, there was work to be done, and every job kept the body in motion. Spinning wool wasn't just a way to prepare for future clothing. It kept the fingers nimble, the hands flexing, and the mind occupied. Mending garments required precision and a steady rhythm, pulling thread through cloth, layering and reinforcing fabric worn thin by time and weather. It may have seemed tedious, but each pull of the needle was a quiet exercise in self-preservation. Women, and often children, hunched over their work, cloaked in worn tunics and old shawls, their hands busy even when the sun didn't rise. And because warmth was precious, they worked in groups, shoulder to shoulder, sharing breath and body heat as they sewed, stitched, and spun the hours away. Even those not engaged in textile work had their part. Grinding grain, shaping tools, or repairing shoes was work that could be done indoors near the hearth. The tools were primitive, but the intention was sharp. Stay productive, stay warm. But some tasks demanded stepping outside into the whitewashed world beyond the door. Animal care wasn't seasonal, it was daily, and it was non-negotiable. Livestock had to be fed, watered, and mucked after, no matter the snow or sleet. And that meant trudging out into the cold at first light, muscles stiff with sleep, boots caked with frost. Yet, these chores were paradoxically life-saving. The movement of hauling hay, lifting water buckets, or brushing down the animals got the blood pumping, warded off the cold, and reminded the body it was still alive. Even the simple act of walking to the pen and back helped keep joints from stiffening, and many peasants kept animals inside or adjacent to their homes precisely because it made access easier and gave off heat, a twofold blessing. But those without such luxury had to move fast, with purpose. Men, women, and children all shared the load. A winter morning might begin with icy fingers fumbling to unbar a gate, steam rising from the nostrils of a shivering cow, the first cluck of a chicken waking. The world didn't pause because it was cold. Neither could the people. Then there were the children, full of energy and indispensable to the family economy. From as young as 6 or 7, they learned that their role was not to sit idle. Their tasks might be smaller, gathering kindling, fetching water from a stream, shaking out straw for bedding, but each one was vital, and in performing them, children stayed warm. They ran, they climbed, they lifted. They learned that their bodies were their best winter tools. Fetching water in particular was an ordeal. Streams could freeze over. Wells might crust with ice. Buckets were heavy and metal, biting at bare skin. But there was no alternative. Water was life, and boiling it indoors became both nourishment and warmth. Gathering kindling was equally demanding. Dead branches hidden under snow needed to be chopped and carried. Every trip outside was a shock to the senses. Bright snow glare, sharp wind, crunching beneath the feet. But again, motion was heat. And children, more than anyone, were in constant motion. Winter wasn't a season of rest. It was a season of intentional activity. Even leisure was woven with movement. Preparing herbs, cracking nuts, repairing tools, scraping hides. These tasks didn't stop when daylight faded. They continued by candlelight or firelight, long into the dark evening. There was no such thing as doing nothing. Doing nothing meant courting frostbite, hypothermia, or worse. And these rhythms were communal. Families moved together. Neighbors sometimes shared chores. One household might split wood while another cooked. There was a fluid, unstated exchange of labor, warmth, and presence. These weren't just chores. They were body-warming rituals, passed down like heirlooms. Even religious observance, the few pauses in a peasant's week, had a physical element. Attending Mass required a walk, often a long one, through snow-covered roads and frozen meadows. But again, the walk was warmth. The kneeling, standing, and singing inside the cold chapel was movement. Even prayer became exercise in winter. For medieval peasants, the cold was a constant force pressing in from every direction. But instead of giving into it, they moved. They worked. They kept going. The fire might be small, the blankets thin, but the body was powerful, especially when put to use. Today, we think of winter as a time to slow down, to huddle under fleece with hot drinks and stillness. But for those in the Middle Ages, winter demanded effort, sweat, and action. Because warmth didn't come from outside, it was made from within. And maybe that's what we can learn from them. That sometimes, the best way to fight the cold isn't to wait it out, but to meet it head on, to chop, to haul, to mend, to spin, to keep moving through it. Because in the medieval world, chores weren't just about survival. They were about beating back the cold with every swing of the axe, every stitch of the needle, every splash. From a wooden bucket, not just staying alive, but staying warm by never stopping.